Welcome to Courageous Conversations, Women and Race. I'd like to introduce you to our facilitators for today's program, Leslie and Rosalyn. Leslie, you now have the ball.
Thank you so much. Good afternoon and good morning, everyone. My name is Leslie Traub. I'm a partner at Cook Ross, and so delighted to be with you here today to talk about this issue that is so near and dear to our hearts personally at Cook Ross and is so critical to our ability to be fully effective in our organizations. I have been with Cook Ross for 24 years and know many of you on the call, and delighted to have you with us this afternoon. I am calling in from Boston, sitting on Beacon Street, and there's street noise, so I hope that it won't be too distracting for you. Rosalyn.
And Rosalyn, you may need to unmute yourself.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, we can.
Yes. Yes, I am Rosalyn Taylor O'Neill, and I have been with Cook Ross about 4 years. I know many of you from my time with Campbell Soup Company and MTV Networks, and like Leslie, I think this is a very timely topic. The questions and the thoughts around the issue of women and race, and I am delighted to be here with Leslie and all of you.
Thank you. Thank you, Rosalyn. Rosalyn and I have a very special bond around this content. I'll tell you a little bit about our history, if you will, our personal history, on how we came to be in this conversation. A number of years ago, a very dear colleague of ours, Robbie Gregg, who works with Cook Ross, came to me after my first couple of diversity conferences had not gone for the first 10, 12 years of my career for whatever reason. And so I would go to these conferences, and Cook Ross has a lot of relationships with people in this business, and I personally have a very deeply multicultural world and have lived in many countries around the world, and I have many people who are near and dear to me who are of many different races and ethnicities, and, you know, daughter-in-laws and so on. So at these conferences, I would find myself in a position where I felt more familiarity with the people who I was greeting than they felt toward me, particularly with African-American women. Robbie had enough courage to have a courageous conversation with me and to give me that feedback, which was critically important and not easy to hear. And I said to him, so Robbie, what do I do with this? It was very devastating to me, actually, to be received in a way very differently than I intended. And so he suggested I call this woman, Rosalyn Taylor O'Neill, who I had met once or twice but didn't have much of a relationship with. And he thought that Rosalyn would be a good person to be able to share her perspective with me on why that may be and what some things might I do to mitigate that. And so I am forever grateful, not only for that, Rosalyn, but for our years of loving friendship and our ability to talk openly about the kinds of issues that present between white women and women of color. So over to you to share perspective on that.
Yes, and as I thought about this conversation, what I realized was that for many of you, I'm guessing on the line, the question of how do we see one another and how when a white woman who is being very authentic enters into a conversation with colleagues and friends of mine who are African American women, how until we each understand how we see ourselves, it is very difficult to understand how others see us. So for Leslie, it was very difficult to understand that black women and white women, especially African American women who I know, and I do not speak from a stereotype, only a generalization, and it's based on a very small sample. It is black and African American, Latino, and Asian and Native women that I have met over the years have a relationship with white women where whiteness actually is on the table. And what we're going to talk about is, for many white women, race doesn't seem to present itself. And so what Leslie kind of ran into was the fact that race, whether it is white race or African American race or Latino race or Native race, in fact, enters into the conversation when we are getting to know one another, when we're talking to one another. And so it is the time that we have to begin to talk about the question of how does it enter and what does it mean, and how understanding that I have a cultural set of beliefs, some of which are based on when and where I grew up, some of which are based on my life today, and that those beliefs, I also have feelings about people who are not like me. And that's really what we're going to talk about, is the way in which we have to come together, not pretending that there is no difference, in fact acknowledging that the way I see the world may or may not be the same as the way that Leslie, my friend, sees the world. And today we're going to talk about based on this thing called race. So we're here to do, very simply, open a dialogue, to begin the dialogue between white women and women of color. I want to acknowledge very quickly that we, in fact, group women of color, and we are as, if not more distinctly different than white women. But for the sake of this conversation, we are, in fact, grouping Latino women, Asian women, Native women, African women, black women, African American women, et cetera, into a group for this. We want to talk about how do we bring together our collective understanding across racial groups for a collective success and well-being. And it seems to me if well-being was ever needed, it is needed today. And we want to begin to understand how our historical and our cultural perspectives influence how we approach relationships with one another and with others, which is how Leslie and I came together. We're also going to talk about courageous conversations, because this is not an easy conversation to have. And how do we become allies? What is an effective ally?
Thank you, Rosalyn, so much for that. And I really like what you said about how this is not an easy conversation. And so what I'd like to do is just tee up some ground rules, not only for this conversation, but for how we approach each other. And one of the very first and most essential ways to do this is through assuming positive intent. And when things go awry, because they will, things will go awry when we're working and engaging across race. We will trigger each other, have our interpretations of what happened, and depending on our background, we will apply maybe a level of sensitivity to what happened that doesn't match the intent. So by assuming positive intent, we actually are able to get there faster, and that we listen for understanding. When those triggers happen, that instead of defending, my first response was defending, to turn that around and let my first response be to understand why you feel the way that you do, and at the same time, to understand why I respond the way I respond. Another aspect of this is to turn our judgments into inquiries. Instead of there they go again, which is a default space for us, it's they, everybody else gets grouped together and they become one. Instead of there they go again, it's to seek to understand. and to learn. This is the only way that we move ourselves through this crucial time that we're experiencing as a society right now. The only way we get to do this is one person at a time, between me and you and within the groups that we're working in, and that's how we impact ourselves on a societal basis. So applying these learnings. For this conversation, if you feel defended or triggered, I want to invite you to be transparent about that and to put that into the chat box so that we can begin to talk about it and work with it. The last thing I'd like to share is to keep our flashlights on. And what that means is in the work of Cook Ross and the parlance of Cook Ross, that we watch what we're making up about ourselves and what we're making up about others, and to have that constant awareness on ourselves, because this is, in fact, tough stuff. These are not easy conversations. It took tremendous courage and commitment to my profession for me to call Rosalyn. It took a lot for me to do that. But I was more committed to my ability to relate effectively than I was my own comfort. And that's what allows us to move into mutually beneficial and meaningful relationships. So I leave you with an opportunity to tweet about what's happening here, and you see the hashtag on the screen, and feel free to share your thoughts out into those folks who are following you and listening to you about this. This is a collective effort. We begin at Cook Ross with ourselves individually and with each other, and we hope to bring this consciousness and awareness and practice out into your world and to expand beyond that. So at this point, Helen, I'm going to turn it over to you, and I'd love to see, among all of the people who are with us right now, 242 people, let's see who's on the call with us. Helen, how do we do that?
All right, we're going to take a poll together. So in a moment, you will see a poll open up on the right-hand side of your screen. Select the response that you feel most comfortable with, and we will take a look at who we have with us today. And this poll is closing automatically in a few more seconds, so go ahead and take a look at that and share your results. All right, just a few more seconds here. All right, Leslie and Rosalyn, this is who we have in our group today.
Thank you.
Wow, that's an interesting group. Thank you. Okay.
Rosalyn, do you want to comment on, oh, the poll was gone. Oh, yeah, let's keep it there for just a moment. Rosalyn, I'm going to put up the next slide, and then perhaps you can comment on who's participating. And I do believe we have an error with B. It's not male or non-binary gender. I think non-binary gender was supposed to be point C. So guys, if you were triggered by that, apologies, it was a typo. And those of you who are non-binary gender as well, if you were triggered by that, and apologies. Rosalyn, what do you think?
Well, yes, I'm not surprised that about 89% of the folks on the call are females. What I think is very interesting is that we have almost an equal number of Black African American and white women, a number of multiracial. And if we look at the slide on women in corporate America, one of the things that becomes very clear is that the participation level of white women is significantly higher by percentage, not just by population, but in fact by percentage, than Black and African American women, Asian women, and Latino, Hispanic and Latino women. By the way, I do apologize to Native women. This was taken from Catalyst, and I am always concerned when people are left out. Even though there appear to be none on the call, multiracial might in fact be someone who's Native. So I want to make that clear that it is not that we left it out. It is in fact from this report. But when we look at the report, what struck me, Rosalyn, was that white women represent somewhere close to 80% of the senior people in organizations in corporate America. Of the group of women. Now, that doesn't say that they represent the majority. They are not the dominant group. White men and men are the dominant group. But when we think about women, white women are the dominant group. That really can't be ignored. It has meaning. And I think it's one of the reasons that we are on this call is because it has meaning. It has meaning in that when I walk into a room, I, Rosalyn Taylor O'Neill, as a woman of color, I am very likely to be visibly one of the few. And in that room, there may not be a lot of women in total, but one of the things that I can be pretty sure of, if you look at the chart, and pretty sure of if you look at my experience, is I am one of a few. And that has meaning that we're going to talk about.
Thanks, Rosalyn. And I also think, just another piece of commentary on this, one of the data points that we were looking for, and many thanks to Nikki Caldwell for your help in putting together this data, a very salient data point, if we could find it, is what percentage of, how much do our organizations spend on leadership development, how much money, what percent of participants in leadership development are white women, and what percent of women are women of color. And this is one of these very practical, grounded places where our blindness and our privilege allows the dynamic of the divide between white women and women of color, that gap to increase. Because as women, when we're participating in those experiences, particularly as white women, we don't see that women of color aren't represented. And we know that those are some of the access points into power in the organization. And so, so this is a place for us to bring some consciousness about our structures and systems and how our overlaying privilege creates blind spots that have us not see where we can begin to make a difference. So to move forward, what I'd like to do is to just go back one, is to offer you a little bit of a framing for how to be in this conversation with each other, both here this afternoon and as we move forward. I'll start with Crystal Joybell. She talks about how the most adventurous journey we can embark on is the journey to ourselves. The most exciting thing to discover is who we really are. The most treasured pieces that we can find, all of the pieces of us, the most special portrait that we can recognize as the portrait of our soul. And that we shared this with you, we think this is meaningful because the way these relationships build in the most effective manner is that when I look over here and I take responsibility for how I see myself, my frameworks, my mental models, how I see myself and how I see you, that's part of the equation. And the second part of the equation is what Gwendolyn Brooks talks about, which is that we are each other's harvest, we are each other's business, we are each other's magnitude and bond. We are not separate.
Yes. As
our president says, this is not about white America or black America. This is about Americans. And that is true in our society. It is true in our organizations. It is true in our one-to-one relationships with each other. And it takes two essential pieces, beginning to look over here and then extending ourselves over there to each other. So that's a little bit of framing as we get now into the looking at myself side. Rosalyn, maybe you can begin to share a little bit about how we see the world and how that impacts our perception and our actions.
Yeah.
Yes? Okay, good.
We see the world through a lens that really is based on all that I learned growing up, all that I heard when sitting around the table listening to my aunts, who were, by the way, my mother's friends, and listening to folks. It forms my background, not only in terms of sort of as we think of background generally as where you grew up and how you grew up, it forms the lens through which I see both myself and others. And background gives us a language to talk about it. When I understand that I don't see the world as it is, I see it as I am, a nice Nin's quote, slightly changed. But it is very important to recognize I see it not as it is, and we're going to talk about that and show you that. Understanding that I see the world through my lens gives me a perceptual interpretation. It structures the way in which I am conscious, the way in which I interact. So I want to show you a slide. And so we look at this slide. Just take a moment, look at this slide. And some of us may see, the next one, Leslie. Leslie's gone out of the picture for a moment.
I'm back. Oh, I thought my picture wasn't on when I wasn't talking.
No, that's not true.
Plug my phone in. So you could see me like fixing my hair and everything?
Yes.
Oh my God. Talk to people. Ignore me. I know you're
okay.
stuff while I plug my phone.
I need the next slide. So we may see that person as looking at him as a radical. We may look at him and feel he's unfriendly, or want to hit it for me? We may see him as well-groomed. We may look at the glasses and think that's an intelligent-looking person, stoic. That is what we might feel. That is, in fact, the way our lens might work. What we actually see is this: hair, glasses, earrings, a neutral expression. That my lens might see him as either intelligent or as stoic. My lens might see him as radical or well-groomed, not because of who he is, but because of who I am. So he's walking down the street towards me, and my background lens gives me a framework that says, here's who I think he is. But in fact, what's really there are glasses, earrings, a neutral expression. So we're going to show you a picture. What I want you to do very quickly, and you can do it in chat, we're going to show you two. You actually can go and whiteboard it, and I'll ask Helen to tell you the answer to that. Is what do you see? Who do you think they are? What do you see about them? Just first impressions, and you can put them on either side. Helen, you want to give them a little?
Yes, I'd be happy to.
A little tutorial. Thank you, Helen.
Sure, no problem. The tools are located in the top left corner of your screen. You've got your arrow tool that you can use to claim some real estate, and the next button over is the text tool, button with the letter T. Click on it. You can type your text on the screen. Now, there's very limited amount of space for 200+ people, so if you prefer, you can also put it in chat.
Let's do the one on the left first.
Great. Great. That's right, everybody. And try not to write over each other. So use use as much space as you have. As Rosalyn and I will try not to speak over each other.
And now we have some people who are writing, I'm guessing, on the right. Okay.
Yep. So
let's
why don't you just go ahead and populate?
Some people see one as a mother. I don't think we saw that on the woman on the left. Both appear to be students. On the left is artistic, African or multiracial. On
the right, we have someone who's a bit dowdy, who's a tired mom, who might be an administrative assistant.
So what we have here is the interesting thing about us is we see two people and we create a story. The way I oftentimes talk about it in work is we make up a story. And we make up a story about people often, all the time. And so that story sometimes contains a mirror that I can look at to say to myself, why would I believe that one person is off from work because she's wearing clothing that doesn't seem to me to be, quote, professional? Or why would I think one is a student, one is a professional? Whatever those kinds of things are. And by the way, there is no right answer. There is no wrong answer. There is no right answer. It's just becoming aware that we do this, and we do this very, very quickly. And we're going to talk about why we do this so quickly. Leslie, you want to talk about fast brain?
I do. I just want to point out a couple of things here. That we see words like proud, intelligent, reserved, too serious. On the left, we see a college student working to put herself through college. Aren't these fascinating interpretations? So it's so important that we are able to distinguish what we see from what's actually real, and how much of what we see. I saw in the chat box somebody identified the fact that this is evaluation. I don't see it. It's a description versus interpretation versus evaluation. And so we have the person on the left as a student, the person on the right as a mother. We've got the person on the left as having a mugshot. So there's some fascinating data in here. And what's true about that data is that it says much more about us as the viewer than it does about the people that we're viewing. And that's important to recognize. We think what we see is true when, in fact, it's simply the interpretation based on my worldview. So Rosalyn, let's talk about that a little bit. Let's talk about that a little bit, and Helen, maybe you can guide us towards how we might be able to get some voices in the room, and just to talk about how this data, right, how Nikki, who is on the left, our dear intern at Cook Ross, how she's noble and has worked her way through college, and the woman on the right is a tired mother, Nikki Spenn. And like, how does that, what happens with that data? How does that impact how we choose to interact with each other and look at each other, and whether we choose to interact at all with each other? So Helen, is there a way for us to hear some of these voices?
Yeah, so if you've got a telephone icon next to your name or a computer headset icon next to your name, we can hear your voice. Just go ahead and click on the raise hand button and we'll unmute your line. If you
and
do
you'll
not
do that, Helen, right?
I will.
Okay, great.
And if you do not have one of those icons and have something to contribute, go ahead and enter your comments into chat. Thank you.
Come on now, there are not this many shy people in America.
All right, well, if you're not sure where that hand is, it's located right below the participant list.
Mm-hmm. Because I will talk for just a moment until we get some folks who are raising their hands. We do this so quickly. Most of us, what's interesting, someone said most of us didn't post what we see, but how we interpreted what we saw. It absolutely does. And it does determine whether or not we engage. If I feel like the person is like me, then I say to myself, okay, I might engage with them. Or if they remind me of someone, I might engage with them. If they look like it's a mugshot, I'm a lot less likely to engage with them. Our assumptions inform our decisions. Sarah.
Yes, Rosalyn. You stole some of my thunder. That was great. That was a good lead-in. But yes, not only would you engage with people that are like you, but I've definitely found that I am biased, and a lot of people are, to like those people more. So I'm going to give them the benefit of the doubt more than I would somebody who seems unfamiliar to me.
Right. Thank you. Katrina?
Yes, hi. You're immediately forming these judgments, and these judgments are coloring everything that you do after the fact, whether or not you decide to engage with them, whether or not you think they're, you want to approach them in conversation or have a conversation with them, or even whether you want to even get near someone.
Yes, absolutely. Tachel? Archele?
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, great. So your point about the assumptions is very true. But the one thing that I fear is that oftentimes when we see someone, we have this perception that has been ingrained in us over time. So whether someone, while it was growing up, or something that we've watched has us assuming that, okay, well, if you look like this, then you must be associated with this. And that's a flaw that all of us have, because we all have our internal and even external biases. So what we have to do is take a step back and say, okay, well, when I look at this person, hypothetically, I instantly feel fear. Fear is the first response. But let me reassess that. If I'm not in immediate danger, in immediate harm, and I don't see that harm coming my way, then let me think about it again and say, okay, well, now this is a human, and if they're talking to me, are they generous? Are they kind? How are we reacting to each other in this given moment, instead of going solely with your initial perception? Because when you go with that initial perception, you might and mostly are completely mistaken in judging that individual according to that judgment. So,
thank you. I'm going to go with one more person, but I want to. We had a person in here, Keisha, who said it's more than how people look; it's how people act. And what we're talking about here is that I might not get to know how you act if how you look through my lens gives me information that says people who look like you, I don't have anything in common with people who look like you. So I might not even speak. That might be that I am sitting in a meeting and you're sitting across the table from me, and we're the only two women in the room. My lens might say to me, this person either has nothing in common with me, or that this person, something about the way she looks says she wouldn't be open to my saying hello, so I might not get to how she acts because I might not nod and acknowledge her presence, which would maybe then lead to some other behaviors. And we're going to talk about why in just one moment. So I want to let one other person in, and then we're going to have to move on. I know there's a lot of dialogue here. We also have a couple of things we really do want to cover. Ovita, I hope I didn't, is that correct pronunciation?
That's great. Can you hear me?
Yes.
What I just typed it. What we see in the other person might affect our confidence level in what we do and say in a meeting, or whether we feel like we're alone, or whether we have someone else who might see life or see the situation as we do. So it affects our confidence level.
Absolutely, absolutely. Thank you. That's really wonderful. And this all happens very quickly. That's the important piece, is it happens very quickly. Leslie?
Yeah, I'm loving this dialogue, and thank you so much for chiming in and bringing your voices in. So I'm going to give you an example of how this actually works, the physiology of how this works in the brain. Let's just use the example where I had a little difficulty, 10 years ago, which is not to say that that difficulty still does not exist, but I have, Rosalyn, why are you laughing?
No, I'm good.
So we'll use the example of that, and the person, I didn't write down names, but the person who spoke before, Avita, you triggered this for me. We're talking about this experience of how we process information. So let's just use the example. I'm at a conference. Leslie, me, this woman right here, I have a great depth of experience with people of different racial groups and ethnic groups. And I have a lot of patterning of successful, loving, meaningful relationships, particularly with Black and African Americans. So the lens through which I see, like I go to a diversity conference, is that these people, mostly women, those of you who know the industry, are there waiting to be my friends, right? And so, and to embrace me and to engage with me in a way that my other friends have done for many years. So there's a catalyzing person or circumstance. So Leslie approaches a group of women of color at a conference that are in a circle talking about whatever's being talking about, laughing, right? And Leslie knows one or two of them, and then I insert myself in that circle. Because from the background perspective, now I shared my background, let's look at the background of what those women could be experiencing, is that they're seeing Leslie, a white woman, approaching them, and through the background of how they might see me as, they go to what's called the fast brain. The fast brain is our intuitive, reflective, quick interpreting, survival-based mechanism that's there to keep us safe. They go into the filing cabinets, each of their unique filing cabinets, and we also might have some collective filing cabinets, where they open the file called Women Like Leslie. And what may be occurring in there is, in their past, women like me insert themselves into their circle, assume intimacy before a relationship is built, think that I'm coming to take away something that is precious to them, which is the opportunity to have time together as a group. And those are some of the interpretations that might be there in the space. And that's, it's as silly as it may seem, it's really based on our survival, which is about our comfort. This is from the emotional part of the brain, the part of the brain that is deeply patterned to respond in a particular way. It's called the limbic system of the brain, where the amygdala is located, and other mechanisms of the limbic system. So that's what happens. I open up that filing cabinet, and that file tells me how to behave and engage in that moment. Now, my filing cabinet says, approach, embrace, be warm, touch, contribute, listen, right? The filing cabinet on some other people's fast brains is defend, protect, wait to be invited, and so on. And so Rosalyn's going to talk for a minute about how those filing cabinets get built and how they inform what our actions are. Rosalyn?
Yeah, there's something, there's some stuff going on in the chat. There's some chat going on that I really do want to acknowledge, and that is, will we talk about structural racism? Will we talk about between white women and women of color? Will we talk about power and privilege? And so the answer is yes. Now, understand that this is 90 minutes, and in the end we will talk about, we're actually going to do a full-scale piece of work down the road. So there's a combination of two things that are going on, and one of them is I meet a white woman. I'm at a conference. I meet a white woman. I actually meet a person who is like me in gender, but who, in fact, I might have and will have all kinds of notions about. Now, if you go back to the charts where we showed how white women are doing inside corporations versus how women of color are doing inside corporations, I actually come into the conversation understanding that the issue of racism, the issue of privilege, the issue of whiteness, all sort of rest in this person. Now, this person doesn't represent all of those things, but for me, those things rest in that person. It makes it sometimes more difficult. So I come in, I see someone, I have all kinds of messages that I have gotten growing up about standards of beauty, about standards of intelligence, all kinds of messages that are, in fact, a function of, if you will, oppression, structural racism, classism issues, and they come into the table with me. I behave as if those things are true about her. The dilemma is that there is no denying that racism is alive and well and alive and all of those things, especially right now in this country, and that the major benefactors of the work that we have done around at least diversity in terms of the numbers are white women. That is true, and it is in fact what we are both talking about and up against, and we will talk about the issue of privilege in just a moment. But it's important for me to understand that I apply all of those things to Leslie. I apply all of the effects of structural racism to her without knowing her. The dilemma around that is, as long as I apply those to her, and let's say that for a period in time, because maybe she's not Leslie, maybe she's someone else, she applies all of the beliefs around whiteness and blackness to me. The dilemma is that we do that so quickly that we miss the opportunities. And there are opportunities. It is not an easy road. And as, I will tell you, as a woman of color, I know that it is easier for white women to not see me, which is, in fact, how racism lives. It is easier for them in a meeting to not see me. It is easier for them to not hear me. It is easier for them to hear themselves and people like them. It is easy for all of us to hear people like us, whether like us is racial, like us is age, like us is gender identity, whatever it is. And I've got to own that I not only does she see me that way, but I see her. And I've got to do something around moving, if you will, from my fast brain, which says, oh, I know her. So you and I, you and I, African-American women, we're sitting at a table. There are 10 white women at this conference. They're all sitting together at a table, and we say to one another, I know them. I know what they're doing. I know what they're thinking. I know who they are. I know what they believe. And we don't go there. We don't move over to that table. We don't say hello because of what we believe. Now, is it possible that we are correct? Maybe. It is also possible that we are incorrect. And until I'm able to say to myself, we have a potential allyship, we have a potential way of working together, that I don't know any more about her than she knows about me, it is going to be difficult to change. Because I go from the bottom of that ladder, I see a white woman, to my actions and behaviors, I walk away. I go from the bottom of that ladder, I'm sitting in a group, I walk through the door, I'm the only person of color, I believe that I am alone, even though there are some number of white women in the room and a predominance of white men in the room or men in the room, and I immediately go to my behaviors about it, and that's the challenge for us. And that's what we have to look at, because not looking at that disempowers both of us.
Thank you, Rosalyn, for that very much. And what we know, I'm percolating on this question about structural racism and prejudice, is that in our experience with all of the combined years, Rosalyn's and mine, 75 years of work in this topic, what we believe to be true is that the only way that we can approach the fundamental structural racism and prejudice that is institutionalized in our organizations is through first looking at ourselves and looking at the stories we make up about each other and allowing ourselves to move into what's called the slow brain. For some reason, there we go. To move into what's called the slow brain, which is where my conscious self, the one that is the more objective and rational, that allows myself to override my ladder of inference to ask myself what is true. And this is the place in our slow brain, which is the red part here, which is the neocortex, the place where our, like I said, our higher order thinking lives. This is where we're more committed to relationships with each other than we are to our own comfort. That comes from the slow brain. That comes from this part of the brain right here. That's what it took. I was in my slow brain when I picked up the phone and I had to call Rosalyn Taylor O'Neill, who y'all don't, if you don't know, she is and was a giant and early pioneer in the work that we're doing. And for me to pick up the phone and call her and say, I need help with this, required me to be more committed to my effectiveness and success in this work than I was my own comfort. And you have to get that it was not a comfortable conversation. So I think now is a good time to move toward talking about perspective, perception, and privilege.
Leslie?
Yes.
Yeah, hang on just a moment, because I want to acknowledge some of the conversations that are going on in the chat room. I think it's really important. One of the questions that has come up is there's sort of an unevenness, that there are, for instance, more negative biases, implicit and explicit biases about women of color than there are about white women, that there's also stuff that goes on within our races where inside that, I may in fact find that it's easier for me to be around white women than women of color, and the intersectionality of race and gender. So I think it's a very important piece as we move to talk about perspective and privilege primarily, to understand that this is one of those issues that's sort of like the onion. One of my early trainers said, you begin to peel back the onion. So we look at sort of our first set of stuff about one another. Then we have to look at what has the world told us, because the world has told me as a young woman of color that I am in fact always less than a white woman. It has told me that every day of my life. It has told me that in so many ways. Now, I've also come to understand that that's a group issue that we have to look at, but it is not the defining individual ways of being that I have found. And part of that is, and I will say it now, and we're going to say it again and again, as women of color, we are very clear that we are of color. Just very few of us don't know. I mean, I walk into a room, my blackness just bursts through the door, okay? And white women come in the room, and they come in as women, and their whiteness doesn't come through the door. And until white women can see that, which is this notion of privilege, until they have the immunity, until they are no longer immune to understanding that their whiteness comes through the door, and he comes through the door and he goes, well, this is really good. There's some positive check marks. My Latina-ness, my Asian-ness, my African-ness comes through the door, and it has some baggage. It has a whole crap load of baggage today. And so part of this is understanding that. One of the reasons we wanted to have this conversation is because I think it is very important for white women to step into their whiteness. And that is, by the way, a difficult thing for white women. I'm just going to go ahead and say it. Leslie and I know that this is true in all the work that we have done. It's not as difficult for those of us of color because every day we are reminded of it. You know, it's the stories about what do we tell our sons and our grandsons and our nephews today about driving while black or driving while Latino. What do we tell our children, our grandchildren about this? And so this is different from what white mothers tell their white sons about driving. I mean, it really is, and we know that, and it starts early. So it's important to talk about privilege. It's also important to recognize that even though I know white people A, B, or C, in fact, I know different about Leslie. I would never have been able to find that out if I had decided that Leslie could not look at who she is in the same way, to the same depth that I can look at who I am. So why don't you talk about white privilege, Leslie? That'd be a good topic for
you. Thank you, Rosalyn. Well, I think you did. You defined it. You defined it, and you talked about the experience of it, and you brought, you brought a passion to it that is, I think for white women, particularly who are not accustomed to the conversation, can feel intimidated by that. And it's so important in the courageous conversations that we have between each other that white women are able to hear what Rosalyn said, that we are able to hear, absorb, not defend against, be open to the lived experience that is so different from my own, and that's the definition of privilege. I don't have to talk to my 22-year-old about how to respond when he gets stopped by police. Rosalyn's 22-year-old grandson doesn't have that privilege. And so one of the things that enables us to engage courageously with each other, one of the most critical variables is that white women, relative to women of color, are able to hear, listen to, absorb, ask questions about, and most importantly, not defend the experience of the privilege that we have as white people in this country. And I think I saw that we have some Canadians. Welcome, Canadians. We'll talk about North America, try not to talk about, and even people who are out from around the world, we'll try not to be geographic specific. So you can see definitions about privilege, you can see definitions about white privilege, and one of the things that we just have to get real with ourselves about is that being white means we don't have to think about being white. And I want to go back to leadership development programs in our organization. White women have the privilege of being invited to participate and engage, and we don't have to look to ask ourselves the question about where are the women of color, because we feel justified in being there. As women, we feel like it's about time that we got to be here and participate in the programs and opportunities that advance our career, and that for most of us, that feels like enough. And what privilege allows us to do is to be there for ourselves and not have to be there for anybody else. And one of the things on a structural basis, and I'm sorry if there's a lot of chat and I can't quite manage all of it from my remote location, somebody talked about the structural racism, that one of the things that we have got to do as partners and allies is look for where we are not showing up, and to open our eyes to the fact that my privilege allows me access to places where women of color do not have access. And unless I see that, I'm not using my privilege to bring equity to my workplace fundamentally, into my society. And so with privilege comes great responsibility. And that's a difficult thing, particularly for white women, to grok. Is that the right word, Rosalyn, to grok?
Yeah.
Yeah, so to grok. And the reason that it's difficult is because white women experience, my experience of myself and other white women is that we experience our own non-dominance, and we're like feeling like we've got to fight for our own advancement, and we don't see how much we stand on the shoulders of women of color for our own advancement. And so Rosalyn and I talked a long time about how to talk about white privilege in this conversation. And we know and recognize that it can be a daunting inquiry, and it is the only way through. So Rosalyn, I would like to pass over the next chat and then go to look at the poll and come back around to the chat. Does that make sense to you?
Okay, sure.
Okay, thank you. Helen, let's do some polls about privilege.
Sure, of course. So I'm going to go ahead and get the first one started here. Rosalyn, before I start it, did you want to set this up?
Well, what we're going to ask white women to answer this question. We have 2 questions for white women and 2 questions for women of color. For men and others in the room, non-binary, people who identify as non-binary gender, I'm not going to ask you to engage in this one. I apologize, although I actually don't. I really do want to have white women and women of color answer these questions, and there are 2 questions for each group. So please answer for your group to the extent that you feel that your racial identity shapes how you see yourself and how you experience the world. Is it a never, seldom, often, or always? And you can decide how you define those words. So Helen's going to run the poll for us.
All right, so this first poll here is for the white women in the group.
Select one.
And then hit submit. Little coaching,
all right.
Rosalyn.
Poll does automatically close, and in a little bit we'll share the results. Rosalyn, my understanding is we're going to finish all 4 polls before we start sharing results. Is that correct?
Correct.
All right. Let's give it a few more seconds, and then we can move on to the next question. All right. Here's the next question.
And this poll is for women of color. This is for white women.
Okay, and where's the polling? My polling question hasn't closed yet, so I don't see the next question.
Mine hasn't changed.
Yeah,
Okay.
it hasn't changed yet. Rosalyn,
Okay.
did you want to set this question up before I open up the poll?
Oh, no, it's just, you know, it's to what extent do I feel that the identity, the racial ethnic identity of women of color shapes how they see themselves and how they experience the world. And this is for white women. To what extent do you feel that as an African American, my identity shapes how I see the world? Okay? Thank you.
All right,
Select
poll
one
has been
and
opened.
hit submit.
Thanks, Rosalyn.
Okay.
All right.
Okay, good. Are we ready for the third one?
Not yet. The system takes,
oh.
actually the system takes a few seconds to close up, so give me a second.
No problem. The next two polls are for women of color. Regardless of whatever your ethnicity is, they are for women of color. And this question for women of color is, to what extent do you feel that racial identity, your racial identity shapes how you see yourselves and, in fact, how you experience the world?
All right.
Never, seldom, often, or always. Select one and press submit.
All right. And then our last of the four polls.
Last question is, for women of color, to what extent do you feel that the racial identity of white women shapes how white women see themselves? So this is, how do I believe that the white racial identity shapes how white women see themselves and experience the world?
All right, the poll is open on the right-hand side. All right, and just
By the way, I'm really sorry for those of you who are on mobile who can't participate. I'm really sorry. It's one of those one of the technology things that we haven't quite figured out. And by we, I don't mean us.
By we, I don't mean me.
yeah, I certainly don't mean me, and I certainly don't mean Leslie, by the way.
And not Helen, because I don't have that much control. All right, well, the polls have all been closed. Rosalyn, which one would you like me to show the results for?
I'd like for you to show the results of the first poll done by white women, and then we're going to look at the first poll done by women of color. So what we're going to be looking at is, for white women, okay, it's it's really interesting. So you never see how it shapes your experiences. To what extent? 34%, a third said seldom, 44% said often, and 21% said always. Interesting, okay? Now, I want you to show the same question for women of color. Remember, that's 234. The difference is, first of all, never is it not a part of how it shapes my experience and how I experience the world, how it shapes who I am. As a matter of fact, often and always and often make up 87% of the poll. That's a very significant difference. Can you go back to the other one just a moment, Helen? Is that possible?
Here you go.
Yeah. So if you notice, it's about 65% have an often and always for white women, where it's overwhelmingly 80+%. Very many fewer in terms of both numbers and percentage who see it as seldom. Okay, let's go to the two polls where we begin to talk about how we view the other.
All right, so this is the one, results for the white women?
Yes. So when I say, to what extent do I think that women of color are formed by their ethnic and racial, it's often or always is 96%. So that's clearly a significant number of white women who say, my ethnic and racial identity shapes how I see the world. Okay, let's go to women of color and white women.
Fascinating.
Yes. 72% say seldom or never. Now, this is very important in this conversation because what it says is, I, Rosalyn Taylor O'Neill, as a woman of color, believe that Leslie seldom or never has her racial identity shape how she sees herself or how she experiences the world. And what that means to me is I don't believe she can understand my experience, since almost 100% of us say we see it as shaping who we are. It's a really interesting way in which what we believe about one another. By the way, I don't know what is true, but it is in fact what we believe about one another. And that's why it is fascinating. Leslie, thoughts about?
Yeah, this is, so Rosalyn, we have, we've got 24 minutes left and it's just getting juicy. Yeah, it is so fascinating, the perceptual divide. And this is the place for us to be curious and have courageous conversations, and for us to really explore, since we've established that our perceptions, our historical perceptions of each other impact our level of engagement, how we approach, how we perceive, when we're willing to stand up for each other, and yet we perceive each other and ourselves so fundamentally differently. So Rosalyn, let's talk. Let's talk. And by the way, we can certainly. Rosalyn and I are going to have a little chat, a little fireside chat about some of our observations about white women and women of color in organizations. And by all means, raise your hand if you want to get in on that and to share perspective. I'd like, Rosalyn, if you don't mind, I'd like to start a little bit by sharing some of not only my personal experiences, but what I've read and studied about this and what I've observed, and some of the challenge areas when we work together. I know for myself that what I observe is that, and I'm going to press pause and explain here. So I don't want you to hear this as stereotyping. I want you to hear this as generalizing. So I'm going to make some generalizations about our groups, because I think that it's useful, even if it's not your personal experience, that it allows us to begin to talk about why these things might happen. So part of my observation about working together is that I see that white women are more interested in relationships with women of color and are more willing to reach out first to establish a connection. On the receiving end, what I also observe is that women of color are more protected and not certain about the intentions of white women in that outreach. White women are the thing that's most terrifying for white women with respect to women of color is rejection. And the feeling that you think that I'm basically racist, that you're interpreting me from the perception of that I'm racist, which triggers my own internalized racism, and that simple action of me reaching out and you not receiving that in the way that I'm reaching out, that I stop right there. That I just touched the fire, I just touched the stove once, twice, maybe 3 times. And the experiences I've had early in my career with that outreach, it's like burning your fingers on the stove. so that when I get to Rosalyn, I'm over here, I've made up a story that you're not interested in me or in having a relationship with me, and so I retract, and then you interpret me as standoffish, not interested, racist, not willing to do the work, and so on. And so from the white woman perspective, that's one of the places that I feel like we get blocked. And one other place, Rosalyn, and I'll turn it over to you, and then we'll see if anybody else is there. One other thing that I've observed that I think is very important is that when we're in managerial, when we're in power relationships with each other, and from the perspective of, let's say, the white woman is the supervisor or colleague of the woman of color and has to provide some feedback, you see, inside of that construct, I may manage my feedback to you. I may downplay it. I may soften it. I may not give you as fulsome feedback as I can that would actually be important in your career, because where I've gotten burned is by giving feedback and having the response be that I'm racist.
Right.
Which is simply a protective mechanism. So that's a lot, Rosalyn. I think a lot. So
No. And we are really conscious of the time left. We are also conscious that this is probably the most important piece of this conversation. So I walk into the room, and the way in which I have gotten burned has much more to do with white women not recognizing that whiteness counts, and in some ways not being willing for me to say to them, I really do have a lens through which I see you that has you first be white. And my experience is that white women say, I'm not white, we're all women. And I say, we are all women and you are white. And that has great meaning, because one of the things that I have experienced in my life is that when it is convenient, white women become white. And when it is, and by that I mean when it comes to that place that says, you stand up for me in a way that makes you vulnerable in your career, I find that white women tend to become white. And it's like, well, and because you hold more positions of power, it has real meaning. Now, understand that I know that it is about rejection, that it is about feeling like if you step across the line, will I step back? Will I in some way do something that diminishes how you feel about yourself? Absolutely understand that. The other piece of that is we have such a long history with one another where it's a zero-sum game. Only one of us is going to get the job. By the way, it's only going to be one woman. And the chances are, in my worldview, better for white women. And so there is no zero-sum game. In fact, there are enough places for all of us to coexist. Yeah. And the more we collaborate, the stronger we become. But that's not been the experience for a lot of women, specifically women of color. It has been, we're in this together. It's a whole sisterhood. And then the question comes up of, my son got stopped. And a white woman says to me, well, he must have been doing something. And that's an implicit sort of notion that says, now you become white and I become not. and that is what gets in the way. And part of what doesn't happen is we don't have this conversation, because neither one of us, I mean, you know, I'm talking out of school here. We're not supposed to tell you that, in fact, we see you as white, and we think you're white, and we think that, by the way, if, you know, the rubber meets the road, you're going to go, I'm white. You know, I'm always, you know, it's like, I'm sorry, I'm going to just be white for a while, and then we'll go back to sisterhood when, you know, all the crap, you know, goes down. So part of what is, I think, by the way, magnificent in where we are in the world right now is we're actually hearing more from white women than I've heard from white women in centuries, who are really coming and stepping up to, I have a worldview that says that I might have privilege in a way that I had not experienced. This is the conversation that we have to have. It's the only way we can get to a place where I say, you are white, you know you're white, I know you're white. There's got to be some way we can use it to our good. You know I'm a woman of color, and I know I'm a woman of color, and there has to be some way we can use that to our good. That's where we ultimately have to go to, which is that notion of ally. But I want to go see what's in the chat room, because I just love the chat room, by the way.
Okay, there's a lot in there, Rosalyn.
Oh my God.
There's a lot. There's a lot.
Yeah. Well, and yeah, we do. There's a place. There's one in here about women of color need to own our own biases. Oh, we do. I am very clear that you know, I have both conscious and unconscious biases that I have to recognize, that I have to shine the spotlight on myself and say to myself, why do I believe this is true about a person I've never met? Why do I believe this is true about a woman I know nothing about? And we are. Not only do we have to be willing, we have to be willing in a way that is authentic and honest, and we need to own our stuff. So part of what Leslie and I do with one another in Courageous Conversations is I own that this is how I see folks, and she owns that this is how she sees folks, and we own where that comes from, and that's the only way that we can, in fact, build a bridge. Because if it's just about what she did or what I did from our points of view, we've seen that our points of view are very different. It really does have to be about, you know, what I'm willing to own and be honest about, and what she's willing to own and be honest about. Yeah. Yeah, there's some great stuff in chat for those of you who can see chat.
What Rosalyn's talking about in terms of owning our stuff, just as a colloquial way of being responsible for how I feel and not making it the truth but how I feel, which is a distinction of a courageous conversation, is that the way I see the world is how I see the world, not the way the world is. And we've got to be willing to engage with each other around these conversations. So I'd like to do one last poll and then talk about what the elements are of a courageous conversation and wrap up by talking about allyship and how important that is to our way forward. So Helen, do we have, is this a poll that we can do, Helen? Can we just
I do apologize. I didn't catch this one in the slide deck, so I don't have this one up. But we can use pointers if that helps.
Can we use check marks?
Sure.
Sure.
Okay. Let's use check marks.
Okay, Helen, how do we do that?
Yeah, so the check mark is located in your annotation toolbar, so where the pointer tool is. You can use your marker, like the blue one that is there, or if you click on the drop-down next to the square mark, you'll find that there is a check mark option in there as well.
Yeah. And just put some check marks. What makes you most afraid? What are we most afraid of in this conversation? A lot of it's around being misunderstood. Your check marks are really interesting. Right. A lot of it is being misunderstood. That's really being dismissed and misunderstood and uncomfortable seem to come through quite a bit. And I think it's important being offensive. I don't want to say something that's wrong. The dilemma for us is, to the extent that I stay in that place, I'm afraid I'm going to say something and somebody's going to say something that's going to make me defensive. Well, you know, African Americans, you know, don't go to college as much as white people do, and that's one of the reasons that, you know, and I'm going to get angry, or I'm going to feel defensive, or I'm going to feel dismissed. I'm going to say that, you know, my grandson got pulled over, and I am 99.9% sure that it's because he was African American, and somebody's going to dismiss it. Well, you know, he was probably speeding, or well, you know, and we get to a place where we are so afraid, we walk away, as someone said. We walk away believing that the other person, that the conversation is over. I want you to know that the reason that Leslie and I are where we are with one another and with other folks is because we did not want the conversation to be over. The conversation was not a comfortable conversation for either of us. Now, if you know, someone mentions here, and I think it's important, if we're inside organizations, there is a greater risk. There absolutely is a greater risk inside organizations for me to step across the line with a white woman and career impact, those kinds of things. That's absolutely true. What I will tell you is practicing these conversations with other folks gives you an opportunity to build the muscle that allows you to have the conversations both inside and outside organizations. Because inside your organization, if you're a woman of color, I guarantee you inside your organization is a white female, is a white colleague who is a woman who would, just as you would like to have this conversation, she'd like to have it. Just as you and I as women of color would like to move beyond it, she would like to move beyond it. And that's where we really have to begin to think about it, is where do we begin to move across those lines? And we can do it because we can recommend that she and I read Ella Bell's book, or that we go to our resource groups, as somebody said, and ask them for ways that we can talk about it. One of the things that you can do is if you're in an organization that has, if you're a white woman and you're in an organization that has an African American or a Latino or a network, you can go. People, yes, will you feel a little strange? Probably, okay? And as a woman of color, if there's a women's organization that for you strikes you as being a white woman's organization, you can go. Because somewhere in there is a Leslie and a Rosalyn. And a Leslie and a Rosalyn becomes a Leslie and a Rosalyn and a Candy and a Joyce, a Leslie and that's really important. So I think there are lots of great books out, and we have a lot of them listed on our website. But that's the work. The work is not, I just don't think it'll work. I don't want to go do it. Whether you're a white woman or a woman of color, that's not the answer. We have about 8 minutes left, and so I want to turn it back over to Leslie, and we can do whatever we want to do.
Okay, thank you, Rosalyn. So I want to make a comment on the board. And what are you just everybody take a look at this whiteboard here. If I had to count all of the check marks on there, there probably, you know, there could be 200 marks on there. And what that says to me is that we're bringing a lot of fear into this conversation. And so we want to acknowledge that and to share with you a model that some of you may be very familiar with. These will be part of the slides that we send out to you called Courageous Conversations. And essentially what this means is the first question is to stay engaged. Don't turn, our bodies want to turn away from discomfort and turn toward the familiar. We've got to reorient ourselves towards experiencing the discomfort of this dialogue because we're more committed to the relationship than we are our own physical comfort. And that's what allows us to transcend, work with, stand in the fire with each other of this divisiveness and to begin to bring that commitment towards our unity together facing the challenge and the threat in our society and in our organizations together, as opposed to group by group, and to speak our truth. And speaking our truth means trusting each other enough so that I can talk about my privilege and my shame and my fear and my vulnerability and my concern about being misheard and about being stereotyped, and trusting you enough to hold that and to not use it against me.
Yeah.
In the same way that I extend that to Rosalyn and she extends that to me, that we extend that to each other. And then this last piece is really important, which is that, you know, it's not like we're going to wrap this up in one conversation and we're going to heal generations of divide between white women and women of color. And so we have to be able to just accept that every conversation that we have, that it's iterative. You know, it's like the circle of life, is that we touch up against it and we go deeper, we touch up against it and we go deeper, and that there is uncertainty in this, and it's a very American desire to wrap things up, but the ability to just sit with what is really what's important. Hi, Ariel. I see Ariel in the corner there. And the last thing I want to talk about is courage, because essentially what all of this requires is courage. And Dr. Maya talks about courage being the most important of all virtues, because without courage, there's no virtue we can practice consistently. We can practice any virtue erratically, but nothing consistently without courage. Courage is the essential ingredient in our relationships. And then Audre Lorde talks about how important it is that we speak our words. When we speak, we are afraid that our words will not be heard or welcomed. But when we are silent, we are still afraid. So it is better to speak, remembering we were never meant to survive. Rosalyn.
Yeah. One thing that I wanted to do, Helen, can you go back one slide, just one quick moment for me? I know
sure,
where
actually,
we are
Leslie
on
has
time.
the ball. Perfect.
Oh, yeah, that's right. Leslie. There we go.
Yeah.
Leslie?
Yeah.
Yeah. It is, when I look at the chat, one of the things that I get is this, what are the answers? And the most important thing that I think Leslie said is there are no quick solutions. I have 200 years, 300 years, 400 years of information about white people. I, Rosalyn Taylor O'Neill. By the way, also about black people, et cetera. So it's very important that we stay in it, that we stay engaged, that we are okay with the discomfort, that we speak our truth. Until women of color speak their truth to white women in some ways that, in fact, are collaborative and have the courage to do that, change can't happen. And I just wanted to make that piece. So go on to the last pieces. We have 3 minutes left. The battery's ready now.
Okay. Thanks, Rosalyn. So here's where we want to wrap up, and we want to talk about allyship. And I'm going to skip over, these will be in your slides, I'm going to skip over some of the problems with allyship and talk about a new way forward, what effective allyship is. That it's about practicing solidarity and being invested in what each other is concerned about. I have to know you to know what you're concerned about. We've got to be engaged so that I can support you in accomplishing what it is that you want. And this is both ways. That we have to intervene for each other whenever inequity is practiced or perceived, whether you are in the room or not. That is a fundamental responsibility of privilege and of our commitment to each other, is to intervene on each other's behalf. And that action is more powerful than words. In the ally world, there are people who get triggered by white people who say, well, I'm your ally. It's my identity. It could be my, my handle on Facebook. And the perception is that that could be there for my own personal gain and my identity as opposed to really serving you and serving the cause of our unity. So actions, everybody, actions.
Right.
Courageous conversations. That we need to sit in the fire with each other a lot. And this is not a one-time thing. And by the way, Rosalyn and I are holding a 2-day deep dive into women and race in November for 20 women, white women, African-American black women, women of color, to spend 2 days digging into this conversation and to sit in the fire with each other. And then finally, where we began our conversation today, that doing our own work to be at peace with our racial identity has to be what we do before we go towards each other. Because if we are not at peace with ourselves, if I as a white woman don't own my white privilege, if Rosalyn as a woman of color doesn't own her own biases and perspectives and her own privilege in venues, then we can't come together in a clean way. What we're doing is we're looking for the other group to validate something over here that I haven't validated in myself. So that's another thing that we'll be doing at the end of the, in November. And so we're going to leave this up for you to look at. Where do we go from here? It is top of the hour. It is such a privilege for me to be here. Always, Rosalyn, with you. I'm sorry we couldn't be together today. And with all of you who were willing to take the risk and be with us, we are in service to each other. Rosalyn, you can have the last word.
Yeah, I want to thank everyone. There's also a webinar that Howard, Ross, and I are going to do on managing fear on the 1st of August. And so you can always go. We'll email you some details. Stay in this conversation is all I can ask, that you stay in this conversation, that you have it with women, that you test it out. And what I know is if there are 200 women on this call, there are at least 4 or 5 that you might find that you can stay in this conversation with. And I want to thank you, Leslie, for always bringing all who you are and just being, one of the people that I really care deeply about. Thank you all for joining us in this conversation. We have all the information we can give you. We will send you, this will be available on the website or someplace tomorrow. And, stay safe. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Thanks, everyone, for joining today's session. To leave the session, just click on the X in the top right corner of your screen. Thanks, everyone. Bye-bye.